This is Neil Townsend, and Neil is the Chief Market Analyst with FarmLink Marketing. Neil Townsend has done one thing during his career in agriculture, write market commentary for farmers. He has worked at the Canadian Wheat Board, Cargill, CWB2, and G3 in this capacity. For the last 3.5 years, he has worked at FarmLink as the Chief Market Analyst. Neil works with his team to make sense of the markets and advise farm clients on timing of sales and marketing strategies. Before embarking on his Canadian ag career, Neil spent 3 years trying to buffer northeastern Thai farmers from information disequilibrium. He lives in Winnipeg with his wife and 3 sons. Please welcome me in joining Neil Townsend. All right, there you go.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, there we go. Got to just find the switch here. I got to get used to this thing on the ear. We'll just let everybody else leave so that we're a nice little snug crowd, but that's okay. I'm not hurt. My feelings aren't hurt because this is going to be an excellent session. And the topic they assigned me was, China and India and trade. I've modified it a bit because, I can't really stand up here and talk to you about market access to places like China and India and really say that, Canada has much power with those situations. I mean, it's an interesting week because Meng from Huawei is doing the extradition hearing is starting today and, or started this week. And basically, right now they're trying to determine whether or not Canadian law and American law are aligned, that the thing she's accused with in the U.S. would actually be a crime in Canada. But, since she has been detained, we really have not had any progress on trade or, we have 2 Canadians detained in China. So I don't have a lot of confidence that, those situations can be solved very quickly. But anyways, one of the things that I've done quite a bit, and I don't know about, this isn't Dauphin, but there's usually some interest in this, is I've been to Ukraine quite a bit. And one thing I tell people all the time is that, I'm just one person talking. You got to really kind of determine whether or not, the information that you hear from one source is totally accurate. So I like to go and see, but this, I believe, I got something here. This is a canal system that runs from Ukraine down to Crimea. Crimea doesn't have a lot of natural water. So this is kind of a strategic thing. And we were driving around one time, and we were right about here. And, I was like, oh, look at, because, let me see, this was very unusual. This is the canal, and there was no water there, because the Ukrainians were draining the canals to deny Crimea water. So I was like, oh, this is very interesting. There's usually a lot of water there. So I got out of the car and I wanted to take a picture to kind of show what was going on there. And I missed this sign because I don't read the Cyrillic alphabet, but it actually says stop mines. So apparently I was in a minefield and all the the Ukrainian soldiers, the 13-year-old boys with machine guns, they came running out to try to stop me from walking into the minefield. And a lot of people consider, marketing or the world of international trade sort of a minefield. Like, we never know what's going to happen to Canada. And again, if you were in a cave like 3 years ago, you never would have been able to predict that, we would detain the CFO of Huawei and now be embroiled in something where we can't get our canola into China, right? Now, this is the most important meeting today. Obviously, the Brandon Ag Days. There is no meeting more important than this. I know Saskatchewan thinks they have one, and Alberta thinks they have one. But, our fate is being determined by this meeting in Davos today. From January 21st to the 23rd, they're meeting there, World Economic Forum. Anybody's there. I think something like 862 private planes are landing at the Davos airport. This is where Bill Gates is, Donald Trump's there, Greta Thunberg. So yes, I would say Brandon's very important, but you should be reading and watching what came out of here. And there was one very interesting thing that came out of this meeting. And I think, it's all well and good to be like considering about very personal issues, but our fate is often determined, in particular for a smaller country like Canada, by what's happening in the world. And one of the big notions that's come out about the 2020s as a decade is this concept of the peak decade. That this is a pivotal moment. The world is going to transform before our eyes in the next 10 years. And what do we mean by the peak? Well, there's a bunch of different things as the peak. And this was the opening talk at the World Economic Forum. And they were saying, like, peak consumption. This is the first time in 2020 that there are more people in the world above 65 than below 18. That is transformative. Nothing is more powerful than that fact. Old people don't eat as much as young people. That's a fact. They're not as productive as people who are younger either. Sad but true. And I'm going to be one of those old people soon too. I'm already old. Peak globalization, peak multilateral, peak bilateral. Canada bet heavily on multilateral. They thought the world is going multilateral. That means we gather all the countries in a room, we negotiate with all of them at once. The world actually went bilateral, one-on-one trade deals as opposed to these multilateral trade deals. So China and the US signed phase one. You know, the media, the cynics, they'll say, oh, you know, China has no plans on obliging that. But what if they do? Then we're out of a trade deal with China, and we need China for a lot of our products right now. Peak kleptocracy. That means, like, you know, too many of the countries in the world that make decisions that impact Canadian farmers, that impact the markets, don't run democracies. They have rule. Putin just did something to, you know, once again extend his rule beyond 2024. He makes all the decisions in that country. If you don't abide by him, you don't get what you want, right? Same thing in China. President Xi is president for life. That was a change to the Chinese constitution, because it used to be you were limited to 12 years or so. Peak inequality. You know, we're getting richer. It doesn't feel like it right now because things are costing more and more, but some parts of the world are not getting that rich. Peak youth. We've already probably passed it. Like, who in the world is going to start to have, you know, 7 or 8 kids again? There probably isn't anybody. So the world from this point forward is only getting older. Peak climate change, okay? The fact of the matter is, we see these Australian fires. Are they directly related to climate change? Probably, but, you know, it's hard to be discernible. It's pretty dry in Australia. They've had big fires there before, whatever. But the point is that climate change, whether you believe in it or not, and I sincerely hope that all of you do believe in it, but climate change is going to dictate a lot of things, and it's going to dictate consumer behavior in a lot of countries. And those consumers, you need them to buy your products. And a lot of them are going to want certain certifications coming up that the way that it's produced is produced. And again, I think the way we do production is very climate friendly, where we have the exact same incentives as people who love the climate and love the world, is because, you know, we don't want to use more chemicals than we need to or anything like that. But it's going to be a factor that we don't control. The consumers control that. Peak oil demand. I mean, this has already probably happened, but they say from this point forward, less and less fossil fuels are going to be demanded. Electrification. And they say that the number of cars driving today, the next 10 years, that's going to be cut by about 20%. They don't anticipate more cars going on the road. Further urbanization, more Uber riding. There was a comment yesterday that, you know, it's something like 65% of Americans who are 16 years old don't have licenses and aren't intending to get licenses, a big portion of them. So people aren't even learning how to drive. It's not a necessary skill anymore. Peak cars, peak competition. I think that's probably the most important thing for everybody in this world, in this room. Like this talk I'm giving, I could go give it in Ukraine, I could give it in Russia, Argentina, Brazil, you know, Australia, all over the world, because the incentives are the exact same for everybody. And, you know, the one, we'll get to it in the conversation here, but basically, like, you know, farmers are farmers are farmers. And whenever you think something's a good deal or something that you want to get to, you know, rest assured that there's somebody in Kazakhstan who's thinking the exact same thing. what is it about Canada? You know, like I love Canada, but I'm saying, like, I don't think we're particularly good at picking winners, okay? And I would say the agricultural sector is a winner, but we tend to take it and we do something. So, like, just here's a little litany of Canada in a nutshell. Like, and probably most of you guys are so young in this room, you probably don't remember some of this, but the older guys will remember this. Like, first there was Nortel. Everybody had to have Nortel, right? Nortel. I better have that in my portfolio. Nortel went to zero. Then it was Bre-X. Oh my God, I need to have this Bre-X. Bre-X, it's the best. Gold. Bre-X went to zero. Then it was BlackBerry. Oh, so proud of BlackBerry. We need BlackBerry. $300 a share. Everybody, okay, it hasn't quite gone to zero, but it's just below about $8 a share now, right? Then it was oil and gas. Oh, everything is about oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas is the future. This is going to make us a boatload of money. We'll be so rich. Oh, don't worry about the fact that, you know, there's climate change and people are building electric cars and people want to get rid of it. And lo and behold, it seems like the supply of this stuff is endless. We'll get to that later on. Oil and gas, boom, bust. Cannabis, oh, you know, I have to have this cannabis in my portfolio. All these stocks. Now there's lawsuits against the cannabis companies. You know, people aren't smoking any more than they smoked before. I mean, some of the quality of the street stuff is better. Oh, sorry, I wasn't supposed to say that. What next, okay? What I don't want to be next is Western Canadian agriculture. I want us to be tactful and tactical about what we do. And part of that, I think, is just planning for the future and right-sizing what we're doing. And I'll just sum it up like this. You know, a lot of people will walk around and they'll say to people, hey, the total value of production in Western Canada is X. And we need to have, you know, another port in Vancouver, more facilities in the east, reopen Churchill, you know, like, and, oh, if we could build a third rail line, that ain't happening, you know. But nobody ever says, hey, what's the total value of what people eat in Western Canada? We got a lot of consumers here, and I think part of our development is to kind of strive to get, you know, more stuff to them, because relying on the world market is a precarious thing, and that's where it's related to this access. So there's a few mantras that I operate under. One is cause and effect. You know, you can't raise prices and expect people to behave the same. You have something like the ethanol era, a 10-year period where we saw like $7 corn, you know, $20 durum, $10 wheat. That creates incentive. And it doesn't just create incentive in Manitoba or Saskatchewan or Alberta. It creates incentive in Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Argentina, Brazil. And some of those countries are helped by their Forex as well. Nonlinear and uneven distribution. So you have something like coffee where, you know, coffee prices get to like a 9-year low. But last time I went to Starbucks or Tim Hortons or any of those places, like, it's not like they're selling half-price coffee, right? So somebody's making some money, right? And again, I'd say that a lot of the products that we produce in Western Canada are susceptible to that because we do incredibly little value adding in Western Canada, right? Most of it is just bulk commodities, just like a coffee farmer in Sierra Leone or something like that, right? Trading versus investing, right? So, you know, a lot of the times we're doing just trading. Like, I made money on that trade deal, done. But farmers know and understand the value of investing, and that's just basically like, you know, investing. The next one, this is the whole principle at which I operate under. People are stupid, okay? People are stupid. It goes like this. Markets are people, people are stupid, markets are stupid. Markets don't behave rationally. That's what you learned if you went to economics in 101 in university or college or high school, that markets are rational. There's an incredible amount of work being done at universities around the world. They've disproved that fact. Markets are not rational. So here we're going to talk briefly about yield, then we're going to talk about climate, consumer, U.S. energy, China, and India. And I'll get through some of these pretty quickly. So yield is king. I mean, that is the truth to an Indian person farming half an acre. It's the truth to Canada's biggest farmer farming 85,000 acres. It's true to a farm that I visit in Ukraine sometimes where they control 450,000 hectares. Yield is king. That's what people want. You know, more yield, the better. This is the most powerful chart. You know, if you want to walk out right after this slide, because this is the only slide you need to tell you where prices are going to go. And that's the U.S. corn ending stocks and days of use. And basically, you know, here is where we got into beautiful territory, record prices, because they need 30 days from the end of their, marketing year to when they first start harvesting on September 1st. And you can see these 4 years, they were sort of in tough for that. But since then, they've been pretty clear, but we're going finally in the right direction. Unfortunately, they're facing more competition than they faced back here. And Ukraine has exported a record amount of corn, and the EU, which imports corn, has also exported a record amount of corn too. So you'll hear things like yields have to offset prices. I'm satisfied with the yields. And again, one of my first jobs in agriculture was working with the guys developing canola back at the University of Manitoba in the mid-'80s, like canola varieties. And I always wanted to say, unfortunately, most of them have passed on to another place. But I'd like to bring them back and say to them, okay, I'm going to describe to you weather conditions in 5 or 6 of the last years, harvest conditions, whatever, and can you tell me what the yield would be? And they would be amazed by what the yields would be because their predictions would be much lower. And I mean, even with canola, does it like a cold, wet finish? Does it like a hot, dry finish? What does it like? We're not even sure about that. I mean, granted, we had some struggles this year because of the prolonged kind of harvest period, but in the end, the yields, still performed quite nicely. Above average strong farm practice. So again, Canada, we have exemplary farm practice. Like our farmers know what they're doing, very, very good. But this skill set that we have is being passed around the world. There's been a humongous improvement in farm practice. Like from the first time I went to Ukraine to the last time I went to Ukraine, it's amazing sort of what you've seen going there, and sort of like the discontinuation of some of the Soviet type practices to more around the same way that we do it here. Our costs are too high. You hear that a lot. 40 to 50 bushels to make it worthwhile. Even when it's ugly, it's double what it was 10 years ago. That's one I've heard too, is we didn't think the weather conditions were good last year, but the yield still kind of performed in the end. We're bulking up our capacity, so we're going to have bulk capacity at the West Coast, kind of increasing it to 17 million tons. We've got container capacity up 2 million tons. So, big increases in capacity. So we've got the capacity to sustain these higher yields. Yield is king. We live in the post-ethanol era. Remember that one. That's a good one to tell people. That means that, there's no current ethanol mandate in the U.S. that is going up every year. It's flatlined. If you read the news and you see Donald Trump and his various buddies there, it's a constant kind of argument they're having about, there's the pro increase the ethanol, there's the post, guys who don't want to increase ethanol. The one thing I'll say that ethanol, as we break our addiction to fossil fuels, ethanol becomes less and less and less, they're not going to need it as much because you're going to be driving more electric cars and electric combines and all this kind of stuff. So I don't have much hope that ethanol is going to be a boom product in North America. China was going to get heavily into ethanol, but just in a little sidebar at the start of this year, they said, we're going to delay our mandate for ethanol. Only acre with no potential is the acre that does not get planted. To kill a crop, you need persistent longer-term drought, aka Australia. Like they've had a drought for 2.5, 3 years. Parts of southern Alberta have also had a persistent drought. But a drought like we had last year where we had a very dry, end of May and June, that is not a drought that kills a crop anymore. I always say the only acre with no potential is the one that doesn't get planted. Ongoing threat, competitors and end users will advance seed technology, make investments in better farm practice. So just going to run through some quick slides here. I don't know how you get the slide deck, but if anybody wants the slide deck, they can have the slide deck because this is all USDA, a little tiny bit of FarmLink stuff in here. But basically, this is world production minus consumption. Short order, you want to see these red bars You want to have a good crop yourself, but you want to see a red bar as big as possible, because that means that, the world is consuming faster than we're producing. But unfortunately, if you look at this, in 6 of the last 7 years, we've produced a lot more than the world has needed. And if you just add all these bars up cumulatively, that's 116 million more tons than the world consumed in 14-15. And it happened to coincide with the end of the ethanol mandate. And since then, corn has struggled to be above $4 on a consistent basis, right? And this is just for wheat. You can see wheat, we've had, 5 of the last 7 years. And again, we were adding significant amounts to the ending stocks. The ending stocks went up by 100 million in 1 year with wheat. People are very good at growing wheat in a lot of different places. A little bit more encouraging here the last 2 years. This is just stacked up cumulatively, and you can see the 4 biggest crops of all time, combined corn, wheat, soybeans, are from, what happened, in the last 4 years. And again, if you want my prediction for 2020-21, it's going to be either the top one of all time or, second or third. We're just good at producing now. World ending stocks, corn, soybeans, wheat, and you can see the 4 record highest ending stocks have also been in the last year. Now, just think of that too when we say that, the population might still be growing, but the number of young people are going to be a diminishing proportion of that population, and that productivity everywhere is going up. And that's just, the stocks change on wheat. You can see we're going up on wheat. Sorry. This is domestic consumption for soybeans. So this was at the same time that we got into the ethanol in the United States, we had this boom of demand for oil seeds and veg oil in China. Now, the one thing that we have to determine about the last 3 years is, has China been disrupted simply because of the trade war, or have they been disrupted because it's the start of their demographic shift? We'll get back to that later on, but I have an opinion on that. And that's just Chinese imports. And again, what concerns me the most is that, the trend has been broken. Do we get back into the trend? We don't know. And you could look, this would be a very similar look for the last 2 years for Canadian exports of canola to China. We've broken a trend there. So when you break a trend of sort of constantly going up to kind of going down, markets don't necessarily recover even when you solve your trade issues. Argentina and Brazil, again, minor factor back in 2000, 2001, major factor in 2019, 20 and beyond. Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, RUK. I mean, again, they've had, they haven't increased their productivity as much as they have in Argentina and Brazil. But, these are big crops. And again, we forget how bullish these 2 droughts were in 3 years. But for the last sort of 6 years, they've had pretty good crops. And again, their incentive, because of their currencies, because of their economics, are to maximize, to plant, not fence post to fence post, but ditch to ditch. Their exports are now, they're Russia is the single biggest wheat exporter in the world now. And again, Ukraine is having a record export program for wheat this year. And Kazakhstan has kind of gotten out of the export game because they are a landlocked country. They don't have access to ports. They're sort of similar. Their distances are very similar to port as Canada's is. What they've done instead is they've gotten heavily into the game of doing processing and value adding, and they are the world's second biggest flour exporter now after Turkey. Okay, climate. This is one of those ones, I did this talk, a version of this talk in Saskatchewan, and they didn't like 2 things about my talk. First thing is they didn't like that it was the day after we had defeated the Rough Riders in the semifinal game to go to the Grey Cup, and I talked about the Bombers for the first 20 minutes. They did not enjoy that part of the talk. But they also didn't generally enjoy the talk about climate and climate change being something that, it doesn't matter about the particulars of it. It's just that the majority of people who are buying products believe that climate change is bad and that it's happening. The majority of people who are buying products also think that, yes, oil and gas is the worst thing about it, but they have a perception in their mind that the other people who are really violating the earth are farmers and farming practices, right? And unfortunately, farmers and farming practices and the governments or whatever have done a poor job of communicating that is not necessarily the case. And probably, farmers are actually the stewards of the land and actually do best practices that are, potentially, very valuable in terms of combating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's a reality. And I'm just these are all linked. So if you get the thing, you can link it and you can just see this is the way people are operating today. And one thing that came out yesterday was they said that they polled something like 7,000 investors in the U.S. And for the first time ever, the majority of them said they want to be ethical investors, and that's the top priority in terms of their investment portfolio, right? Including very concerned about climate change. So Wall Street, go where the money is. And they say climate change or the notion of it, that's where the money is now, right? So Wall Street's going to pay attention to that. Insurers grapple with property losses as extreme weather intensifies. So, I went to get my house insurance last year and I was like, what? It's up 20%. Why is it up 20%? And I was told because of flooding in eastern Canada. And, if you read enough stories about the flooding in eastern Canada the last 2 out of the last 3 years, you cannot read an article without them saying climate change is the culprit, right? So again, we're paying more for insurance. The carbon tax is probably here to stay. Can conservatives adapt? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. But we hate the carbon tax, but it is probably here to stay. And again, Canada, which is like the Boy Scout of the world, which signs all the deals and tries to do all the, what we are required to do, is, we might say, well, we don't want to do something, but because we have an obligation to a deal that we signed, we have to do that. And Canada will want to comply with the various deals that we've signed. This was out yesterday. Palliser says grain drying exempt from Manitoba carbon tax. Just wait. This will not probably pass with, the general public, and it won't be something that may be allowed by some of our obligations under, these trade deals. It might go for this year, but again, he really probably doesn't ultimately have the power to decide what goes in the carbon tax and what doesn't go in the carbon tax. So, it all depends. Climate change, scientists warn over impact on food security and oceans. Maybe there's some opportunity. People say that, central Canada, or the Western Canada as we call it, stands to benefit more growing degree days, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the markets that we ship to, like a country like Bangladesh, where 80% of the population live 2 feet below sea level. If the oceans rise, they're going to need more food, blah, 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 blah. Maybe we benefit that way, but we don't know. So the consumer, and he's tied into the climate in terms of, 2:30, okay. The consumer, I've been to a lot of things, and I really enjoy the concept of the consumer, and I was very lucky the U of M invited me last year to hear some ag diploma students do their final projects, and there was somebody from the Keystone Agricultural Producers there, and her question each time was, what would you do to influence, urbanites about the way that farms produce food and stuff like this? And, all of the kids, young people, they gave very eloquent answers, but the problem is that, no amount of YouTube videos that you could produce right now are really going to sway popular opinion, right? We're not, go back to my concept that people are stupid. It's not that we're bad, it's just that we're so underinformed, and we like sort of the worst possible story. So on GMOs, we like, oh, they're putting fish into wheat or whatever. You know what I mean? That's the headline, as opposed to golden rice would save 600,000 kids a year if they were allowed to produce golden rice in India or something, or 600,000 over 10 years in India. People don't really want to be informed. That's my opinion, at least. Are they better informed? I don't think so. There's just too much noise out there. If you're trying to find out what's a good food to eat, what's not a good food to eat, it's very difficult, and again, there's just too much noise. What do they want? The consumer is fickle, right? They decide they like something, They buy it, then the next year that's off the menu because why, right? A classic example is avocados, for example. Like, still very popular. Avocado toast is still very delicious, but people are, in certain regions, they're saying, oh, that's the worst for the climate. They use so much water. They're growing in areas that are already bereft of water. So there's a big anti-avocado movement now. The notion of clean. It's one thing where people want GMO-free food or they want this, or that. But one of the most powerful things when you ask a consumer of what kind of food does he want, he says, I want clean food. Well, look at what's happening right now with glyphosates. Glyphosates have been used. They save a lot of money. They save a lot of effort. They're effective. And most of the food that ends up in the food channel or the grain or oil seeds that end up in it don't have any trace of glyphosates on them. Yet a consumer is so particular. He's saying, like, even if it comes into contact with it during any point in the life cycle, I don't want it. Right? So oats is a prime example in Manitoba where, nobody used to ever, granted, the glyphosate is just used as a desiccant there. Maybe that's not best farm practice. It's a convenient practice, whatever. Don't throw any bricks at me for that. Just telling you the facts. But the point is that, people say, well, I won't use it if I get a premium. But the market has decided, no, that's just the requirement now for human quality oats. You're not going to get a premium for that. Can they understand, this is one thing, could I go into a room, and maybe I'm not the best person, but could a farmer go into a room in New York City and convince 30 hipsters that the way that we do conventional agricultural practice is going to produce them clean, safe food? I doubt it. I encourage you all to try, but I doubt it. There's just too much information out there that, seems to have the necessary vetting that would say, no, I'm not going to listen. And the problem is increasingly in the world, sides that have different opinions, they don't ever talk to each other or get into the same room, right? So, you get silenced before you even have a chance to say anything. The cloak of trust. This is a very important notion too, that we had a really good speaker come to talk to us from England, and he said that, actually it's not the consumer you need to educate, it's the bulk buyers of the value added like baking or, cookies or whatever it is, or meat or that. It's like, the Costco's or the Walmarts or that. It's very, very hard to get a SKU onto the market, to get a product onto a shelf. And the people who control that are actually a very, very small group of companies like Walmart, Sobeys, these kind of guys. And they have decided that for their own purposes, probably because they have a lot of good data on it, that when they put certain things on the label of the packages that they sell, and an increasingly important part of selling products is the in-house product where, somebody else makes it, but you get to slap on the Kirkland brand or, the Walmart brand or the Sobeys brand. They've decided that what consumers want to see is clean. They want to see all this stuff about, it's organic or it's good for the planet and this kind of stuff. So, maybe that's one hope that, you don't actually have to convince all the buying public. You have to convince the people who sell the stuff that the public eats. But again, their data shows what people buy. And they're investing in what they think people want. And again, virtue eating, I think, is just about the most important thing. Nobody's probably going to tweet that they were listening to boring old me, but, later on they might go to some restaurant and they have just the most splendid cheesecake or whatever. They're going to take a picture of it, and if it's something that said, this is a bespoke cheesecake that's been made by, a certain chef and it's bound to save the planet, and you put that on your Twitter and all of a sudden you're a good person, right? And it's one of the rare activities that we do 3 times. Looking at me, I may do 6, 7 times a day eating. But the point is that, without ever leaving your kitchen or leaving your nest, your safety spot, you can signal to people, hey, I'm a great person. And part of that is I'm eating a steak today, but this cow, he volunteered to be my dinner. You know, it wasn't, it was his choice. You know what I mean? Like, and it gets, and you know, again, like I show this picture and I mean, they love it, you know, like these are that you're selling to nowadays. The future consumer, like one thing is like, you know, unfortunately in Canada, we're still sort of sold this line that like the consumers in places that we consider poor or developing is somehow like lesser informed than we are. Actually, one thing they have is that, you know, if you go to grocery stores in a lot of countries around the world, you'll be surprised at how many things are, you know, are exactly the same as here. And people are getting much more conscious of what they eat. And with urbanization, a far higher percentage of people are going not to the traditional market, but they're going to a grocery store and buying that. And so, you know, the markets we have to focus on, I think, are probably sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, right? And those are where some growth is still possible. Less consumption per capita in the EU, North America, as population ages. What are they concerned about? Climate change, a little bit, sustainability, price, taste, local, health, nutrition. So, you know, it depends what's the most thing. And again, this is probably the most important thing. Like the last 6 years, we haven't had any supply shocks, right? We lived in an environment of abundance. I'll tell you what, I raised the price of your standard loaf of bread by 4 times or 3 times. People won't care too much about organic bread at that point, right? So, you know, like the next time we have like a prolonged drought somewhere and, you know, corn goes back to $6, it might not happen this decade. Maybe it will happen next year. I don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball. Let's see how people consider what kind of, you know, corn chips they want at that point. This is one factor I think that, you know, when we're talking about the world, I don't see this covered to the extent that it should be covered. As the biggest game changer in my lifetime for sure is U.S. energy independence. And no one predicted this. No one. You know, like if we go back 10 years, we were still talking about peak oil. Like we'd never find more oil than we found, and that it was going to be, you know, $400 a barrel or something like this. But just here's something to think about. And I know, you know, this is a woke, hip crowd here. So, you know, Facebook was created in February of 2004, okay? So, you know, if you're 16 years old, you know, come February, you've never lived in a world without Facebook, but I have lived in a world without Facebook. U.S. field oil production in February 2004 was 161 million barrels of oil. U.S. field oil production in August of 2019 was 383 million barrels of oil, more than doubled. Nobody predicted that. On the natural gas front, even more dynamic. North Dakota income in 2004 was, you know, $6,000 below the U.S. average. In 2019, it's $12,000 above the U.S. average. The sole contributor to that, a little bit farming, but farming's kind of faded a bit in the last 3 or 4 years, to be honest. That's oil and gas there for sure. The United States surpassed Russia and Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest crude oil producer earlier this year, based on estimates in the short-term energy outlook. And then this is just to show you in 2018 what happened. And you can see number one producer, United States, and 18% of you know, oil production in the world today. The U.S. is not part of OPEC. The U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world. A large part of this is because of that. It was very interesting when they when they announced that they were going to sign phase 1. The Chinese held a press conference. The Chinese were talking in, obviously, you know, Mandarin. It was being translated. They did not mention in their talk, this is like not this past week, but about a month ago in December. They did not mention for 1 minute anything about their agricultural buying commitments. But they did expand at length on how much they're looking forward to buying natural gas and oil from the United States. So, you know, they are in deficit. The U.S. is in surplus. This dictates so much foreign policy. The situation we had in Iran last, you know, this month where they, you know, dropped a bomb on the Soleimani, who they knew for the last 10 or 15 years was like the major leader of, you know, problems in that region in terms of killing U.S. servicemen. They probably can't do that if they aren't energy independent, in my opinion. And again, it makes the policy of the United States much more intractable. They're not going to have to play nice all the time going forward. And it gives them the power to do things in a more bilateral way. Trump is maybe, he's obviously a bit of a wild card, but I consider him partly a symptom of this fact because he is the first president to operate with the U.S. being energy independent. And it's a huge move. And I mean, again, older people in the room will remember the 70s and the oil crisis. They'll remember, the first Gulf War where we panicked because they took over Kuwait. They'll remember the second, war after the 2000, 9/11 and all that. That's a big one. China, demographics. 20 minutes? Okay. So this talk was supposed to be about China and India. So now I'm on China. Here's my point on the trade. I made it at the start. We don't know when China is going to stop being mad at us. How long can countries be mad at us? Well, they can be mad at us for a long time. I can't even quite remember what we did to Saudi Arabia, but somehow we offended them several years ago, and still to this date, when they have a barley tender or a wheat tender, the only country that's specifically named as being excluded from the tenders is Canada, purely from a political point of view. I could make some comments about G3, but I will not. I visited China about 14 times. I've gone to the northeast part of China, which is sort of like their corn belt many times, and I love to go to these countries. I like to walk around, see what's going on. And also, I'm a Canadian, so I like to follow the rules. And I did notice, actually, I'm staying in the Canada Inns Hotel here, and they have very strict rules in their elevators, too. Like, I'm not supposed, and I'm a big guy, like, I'm not supposed to jump up and down in the elevator because it might stop. But anyways, I was in this elevator in China one time, and I was reading the rules there, and it was like, the following workers in the elevator should be accompanied. I was alone in the elevator, I think. So under the age of 7, I thought, that's a pretty good rule. You don't want like 4 or 5-year-olds in the elevator by themselves. Like, where are they going? Who knows? Serious heart disease and severe hypertension patients, also a pretty good rule. The blind, pregnant women, not sure about that one. Low, almighty, and mental patients. And as I said, I was pretty glad I was alone in the elevator at the end of reading that. But Chinese demographics are humongously, to me, it would just be so fascinating to be born in Canada today and get to live like the next 80 or 90 years and see the world transform. And one of the big things that's going to transform is China. This thing is totally out of date because these numbers are not accurate in any way, shape, or form. One of the big news items in the news earlier this week, again, this is something they're talking about at the World Economic Forum, is that China released their birth rate for 2019. In 2019, almost 5 years after they ended the single-child policy, their birth rate was lower than it was since 1961. 1961, there was a drought in China that killed, nobody knows exactly how many, but a famine and a drought, maybe a million, maybe 2 million people. Anyways, you don't have a lot of kids in famine. In northeast China right now, the birth rate per woman is about 0.48. That is unobservable except for in times of severe stress like a war or a famine. And, they're decreasing very, very quickly. And there are some projections that by 2100, the population of the United States will be 600 million and the population of China will be 650 million. You talk about changing, the face of the world and how things flow. That's very, very dramatic. Now, will that happen? No. I mean, every day is a new day. But once people stop having babies, it's hard to get them convinced to have babies again. So, and the Chinese, they want to be richer. They've been, they had 2, then 1, especially in urban areas. They're on the downward thing. And one thing we've learned from Japan, where the population has been declining since about 2000, is that a declining population is very hard to encourage economic growth to the same extent. And economic growth, for better or worse, that is the grand poobah of them all. That is the most powerful factor we have, that and low inflation. But now our inflation is too low, so we want higher inflation because demographics are shifting. What it means, these are all, again, you can click on these and you read the articles, far smarter people than me. They ended the one-child policy. They allowed them to have two. And here was their concerns: response to an aging population amid concerns over the economy. They announced that OCP made China more powerful, the people more prosperous, and the world more peaceful. One of the main reasons for the northeast part of China is like the Rust Belt in the U.S. If you go to a city like Syracuse or Rochester and you're like, oh my God, like Rochester, it looked like it was booming in like 1880. That's because it was booming in 1880. It's a little bit more, compact, the timeline in northeast China, but that's the first place that industrialized in China. And when you drive into those places, you can see actually signs of depopulation. You can see discarded and empty apartments, all those kinds of things. And, they have the world's lowest total fertility rates right now. And, I mean, it's very, very, stunting to growth and stunting to things. China, but the one thing about that Northeast is, I don't know how many people are in this room, but let's just say 100. And there are some empty seats here, or there are a bunch of people dressed as seats. If I brought in an equal number of Chinese farmers from the Northeast and had them sit beside you, I'd raise the average age in this room by 15 years. They're about 70 years old on average. They're farming small plots right now, but from the north up near Russia to the south down to a place called Harbin, which is a big kind of northern city in China, the farmers, there's no generation coming behind them. And that land is being consolidated, and it's being consolidated fast. First time I went to China, I did not see any big implement dealers. People grow corn by hand, and they grow corn on corn on corn on corn on corn on corn on corn. That's the only crop they grow. Now you go there, you see on the suburbs of Harbin, you see, John Deere dealerships, Chinese brands, the red stuff, Class from Germany, all this kind of stuff. And farms are being consolidated very fast. And when you consolidate farms, you make more investments, you farm better. And they have land. Good land does not go out of production. And that's the best land in China, in the northeast part of China. China has lowest birth rate. That's just, the new one I talked about. This was the biggest news of the year in the last 365 days. Very small reportage on it yet, but the smart journalists will start to write about it. China and GM crops. Reuters and the IGC reported that China, for the first time, issued a biosafety certificate to a domestically grown GM soybean trait and to 2 new GM corn types. This is huge news with humongous implications. China in the 1970s decided, why do we import so much wheat? We grow lots of wheat. We grow wheat on lots of different land. And they decided in the 1980s, we're going to get to world-class wheat yields. And they did it within 10 years. And now China is a minor importer of wheat and one of the biggest producers of wheat in the world. They produce a lot of corn, but they produce a lot of corn with much smaller corn yields than the U.S. This is an example here. You can see the U.S. yield and the China yield. Imagine with GM corn and modern farm techniques and amalgamation of farms and better farm practice. Nothing against the small hand farming that they do in the Northeast, but when you mechanize, you put in a rotation, a little bit more concern about the soil, you raise this yield. If they even cut half of this yield with the U.S., if they go up to 8, that is a game changer. China is now a net exporter of food. And if their population is going from 1.4 billion to 1.3 billion to 1.2 billion to 1.1 billion, is it wise for us to point everything off of the West Coast to find markets where the market won't be there, where there will be one of our biggest exporters? They'll be one of our biggest competitors? I don't know. This is just another way to show it. And you can see the United States is unparalleled in corn right now. All of these countries, Canada's in the second place, all of these countries are bettering their practices to improve their yield. And, corn is profitable. And again, think of it like there's the mighty US dollar. It's a pretty strong, powerful thing. Russia, basket case. Mexico, basket case. Ukraine, basket case. Argentina, basket case. Brazil, basket case. these currencies are always going to be at a discount to the US dollar until their governments change or do better practice. So the farmer there, he sees a different set of incentives than we see, right? Because he's like, wow, it's a record price in local currency, even though on the world in US dollars, it's not at a record price, right? So again, and that's why yield is king, as I said before. India. And again, I think like there's way better people to talk about the trade issue with China. I don't have an answer to when China is going to. The best case scenario would be if the court this week finds that actually what she's being accused of in the U.S. is not a crime in Canada. Now, this is an interesting thing. I'll go back to China for a second because, again, you have to read sort of the news a little bit longer, but there's an Australian woman from a university who's being detained in Iran right now by the Iran government. Now remember, the accusation against Meng and the CFO of Huawei is that they sanction busted in Iran. They were selling stuff to Iran that they shouldn't have. They got around the sanctions on the nuclear deal into Iran, right? Anyways, this woman in Australia, she is, being held. She went to a conference there. She's an Islamic specialist, and 2 people allegedly reported that she was spying, so she's being held there. What's happening back in Australia is Australia has about 7 or 8 Iranians, various Iranians, that they've arrested at various times on sanctions busting. So Australia is playing along with the U.S. They're saying, okay, you sanction bust, we're going to arrest you. To the best of my knowledge, and I could be totally wrong about this, I have yet to hear that Canada has any detained people in the legal process who have allegedly sanctioned busted against Iran. So when we look at that court case in Vancouver on the extradition hearing, like if it were in Australia, they'd probably say, yeah, our rules are basically the same because we have these 7 people arrested for sanctions busting. So yes, this is the same thing. But here in Canada, I'm not sure what the court will find, and I'm not sure if they'll say that, Canada has to follow the same rules on whether or not the sanctions have to be applied. So again, my best guess is that they're going to allow it to proceed to the next level. Our best hope is that, Trump and his buddy, President Xi, decide that maybe, they should do something to get this, things. But again, it's leverage for the United States in these trade deals, just like the tariffs are. It's, we have the CFO kind of in the legal process. So from a Canadian point of view, yes, we can send all the delegations we want to China, and we can say that, yes, we'll work with you on all the phytosanitary concerns that you might have, but is that the real issue? I'm not smart enough to figure it out. I think it's a political issue, and it won't be solved until the politics are solved, and I don't see a pathway for that for China. But the one thing I will say going forward with China, in particular, if they start increasing their own productivity and they start to be more of an exporter, is we're going to see, and they don't seem to be getting any more democratic anytime soon, that we will see more action like this, where they decide that, we can put up some artificial barriers against Canada. And one of the big things is, because of all the bilateral structure in the world now where people are making their own deals one-on-one, the strength of the World Trade Organization is diminishing as well. And, everybody's sort of still a part of it, and there's a bunch of cases like Australia and China used to be much better friends than they are today, but the Australians and the Chinese are mired in a whole bunch of WTO arguments right now. One of the big ones is on barley. And that's why in the last couple of years, Canada has really pumped in a lot of barley into China. So I'm going to finish up with India, and, they told me I only get paid if 50% of you guys stay awake, and I think I'm close. So if you see your neighbor, just give him a little nudge if he's nodding off. So India is an interesting. There's going to be a lot of words here. I'm not going to say all the words, but my point on India and my point on China, my point on all of the rest of the world is that, there's not too many countries. Maybe Saudi Arabia is the one example of this, and China in the current case, but usually trade policy is not set by, I can't stand Canada, let's cut them out. Trade policy is often set because of internal domestic situations. And India is the most glaring example of a country where, I don't think the Indian government cares too much about what proportion of the vote they're going to get in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or Alberta, right? They care about, Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, and that kind of thing, and they act therefore. The other thing about India is that they have an incredibly sophisticated, advanced, knowledgeable, long-term successful arbitrage class. These are people whose business is trading. And if they can see any sort of loophole, any sort of opportunity to buy low and sell high, import, they're going to take it. So a lot of Indian policy is not directed at Canada. We're sort of collateral damage. Indian policy is directed at this arbitrage class in India. Speed up, slow down, speed up, slow down. And it becomes a kind of a battle between food security versus income security. India is one of the rare countries in the world where farm size is not getting bigger, it's getting smaller. Productivity is still pretty good there, but it's not taking the big advancements that it's made in a lot of other places because farm sizes are very small, undercapitalized. Maybe you've heard recently, it's a terrible problem around the world. Doesn't seem to be as much in the focus in 2019-20 as it was maybe last year, but it's still a very important thing about farmer suicide. India is off the charts with farmer suicide because a lot of farmers feel that, because of a government payment for them being dead, they're more valuable to their family dead than alive. That's because they're farming such small plots of land. And the government is very sensitive to this, and they were particularly sensitive in 2019 because they had to get reelected in 2019. Accomplished arbitrage class, smaller farmers with challenges, susceptible to climate variance. One strength maybe that Canada has, and we've seen a lot of variable weather. Weather is not climate. Weather is something that happens. A lot of weather makes climate over a long period of time, but we've seen different things where temperatures are going up, and India is susceptible to this. Growing middle-class consumers, India they have the world's biggest middle class, and maybe China has the world's biggest, they're the second biggest, but they're incredibly nuanced. A lot of them they have a very high proportion of people are vegetarians there, so their food is a little bit unique, which makes us, with the pulses and that kind of thing are very valuable. And their population is still growing. They haven't quite controlled that problem yet. They're going to pass China as the most populous country in the world, probably in this decade. Again, they are actually urbanizing, and recent data says that, they're actually seeing some cut to the fertility rate, but the fertility rate there is still, above 2, so 2.1 is replacement because there's a few kids that don't make it. Increased farmer incomes, double by 2020, so that's the goal of the government. When they set a target in India, they set an ambitious target. And they said this in 2018, we're gonna double the farmers' income by 2020. They have 450 million farmers. It's very important to remember, in India, a farmer can both be a consumer and somebody who's subject to getting food security from the government, payments from the government, right? So I only got a couple things. They want to be self-sufficient in pulses by 2022. The government buffer stocks are large and going out of condition. You can read this. This is just all the different things they've done, the different tariffs. Sorry, got to hurry here. They put on a lot of tariffs. They keep methyl bromide. They keep saying we got an exemption. They keep extending that, but it's never a guarantee that we're going to get that extended. You see all these trade barriers. They have a whole history of it. But this is the one I just want to show you quickly, is that, this is where they needed so many Canadian pulses because they only produced 17 million. Since then, record crop, near record, potential record. So they've kind of solved their own problem, and that's why the trade barriers have come back on, is because they've been more productive. Here's the conclusions. Okay, yesterday, if you leave with anything except for please, Neil, stop talking. One thing is that, so much of the way we behave in Canada, the big decision makers, is they do a bunch of research about what happened, and then they decide, okay, that happened. Let's make sure we're well positioned when that happens again. But yesterday is not a great predictor of tomorrow. okay? Just because the Jets lost last night doesn't mean that, well, maybe, I don't know. Change is inevitable. The categories are not mutually exclusive, so you got to think about that. That's your homework. Trade tensions and wars, they do cause grief. And I mean, there are always, when they end the year 2019 going to 2020, they're always going to tell you the biggest risks going forward are trade wars, trade tensions, actual wars, these kinds of things. Like, the market and commodities and everything, we like stability. There can be a little bit of a benefit sometimes to the grains and oil seeds when things really explode, but that doesn't last usually too long. Geopolitics should be about cooperation, win-win. I'm a firm believer in that. They are not currently, about that. We have two countries that really won't give us the time of day to solve a problem that's not really, the product of, say, like the Canadian people haven't decided that we don't like Saudi Arabia or China or anything like that. I mean, maybe we don't. I'm not sure. But I'm just saying it's sort of a one-off thing. And we live in an interconnected world. I hope that this kind of comes out more and more as we go forward. But right now, it seems with the bilateral thing, it's like I just need to talk to one person, make an agreement with one person, and all the people not in the meeting, they can just forget about it. Incentives are known. This is one thing that's big. Like, the sophistication of a farmer in Argentina, Brazil, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, it's just like our sophistication. They know what they're doing. They know what their incentive is. Their incentive is to produce more crop and sell it at the highest possible price. Strategic adaptation is critical. So, when you're looking for investment in your own farm and that kind of thing, you have to make sure that, I think the previous speaker was talking about succession and different things like that. But, you got to make sure that, you have a plan going forward. Okay, last slide. Another country I visited many times is Australia. And, great country, great people, love it. This was in the town of Gurley, which I believe is in northern New South Wales. It all runs into one another. But anyways, I came to Gurley and I want to learn something about the places I visit, right? So this rock says, hey, these are all the people who made this town great. And there's a whole list of them down here, a whole list of them down here. If you walk around on the other side of the rock, even more names. And I was like, man, I live in Winnipeg. I don't have a rock dedicated to me or anything like that. This was the entire town of Gurley, one bar. So awesome. Okay, thank you very much. And again, I'm not sure how they get the slide decks if they want them. Do you put them up on a website? Yeah, so apparently they're available online, but if you have any questions, just contact us at that number and they'll direct you to me. Thank you very much.